She almost put it down after the first chapter. The book had been sitting in a box of donations at the library sale for $2, and she had bought it the way you buy things at library sales, without much intention, drawn by a cover and a vague sense that she should read more. She had gotten 40 pages in over 3 evenings and found it slow. The writing was self-important in the way that certain amateur true crime books are self-important, the author inserting himself into every paragraph as though the case existed primarily to give him material. Then, she reached page 47. There was a detail on page 47 about the position of a turquoise bracelet found near the body of a woman named Teresa Sandoval, who had been killed outside Espaola, New Mexico, in the spring of 1993. The detail was specific. It was visual. It was the kind of thing you would only know if you had been there, because it had never appeared in any news report, any court document, or any public account of the case, a fact the woman reading the book happened to know. Because Teresa Sandoval had been her college roommate, and she had spent 30 years following every public thread of the investigation that had never found her killer. She set the book on her kitchen table. She picked up her phone. That phone call, made on an autumn evening in 2023, would close a case that had been open for 30 years and end the freedom of a man who had been hiding in plain sight. Inside the pages of a book he had apparently believed proved how clever he was. He was wrong about that. Espaola in the early 1990s was a small city of about 8,000 people in the high desert of northern New Mexico, situated in the Rio Grande Valley between Santa Fe to the south and Taos to the north, in a corridor of land that had been continuously inhabited for centuries and that wore its layered history the way the landscape wore its colors, visibly, unapologetically, without explanation. The Spanish colonial churches were still the tallest buildings in many of the surrounding villages. The acequia ditches that had irrigated the fields since before the United States existed still ran in the spring. The mountains to the east changed color 4 times a day depending on where the sun was, and the smell after the summer afternoon rains, petrichor on hot red earth, sage and juniper, was the kind of smell that people who grew up there said they could locate themselves by from 1,000 miles away. Teresa Sandoval had grown up in Espaola, the eldest daughter of Ernesto and Concepcion Sandoval, who ran a small hardware store on Paseo de Huate. She had gone to the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque in 1984, graduated in 1988 with a degree in elementary education, and come home to Espaola to teach, which was what she had always intended and which her mother said surprised no one who had ever watched her with younger children. She was 29 years old in 1993, in her 5th year at Carlos Vigil Middle School, teaching language arts to 7th and 8th graders. Her students called her Ms. T. She let them choose their own reading for the independent study component of her class, which in 1993 was considered a mildly radical pedagogical position, and her classroom had more books in it than any other room in the building. She ran on the road along the river 3 mornings a week before school. She drove a red 1988 Toyota pickup. She wore a turquoise bracelet on her left wrist that had belonged to her grandmother, a piece she had inherited at 18 and put on the day she got it, and, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, had not taken off since. She called her parents every Sunday. She had been seeing a man named David Archuleta, a Forest Service ranger based out of the Espaola district, for about 2 years. She was also, in the spring of 1993, involved in a land use dispute that had put her in contact with a man named Garrett Finch. Finch was 41, an Anglo transplant from Colorado who had moved to the Espaola area in 1988 and established himself as a self-described local historian and freelance writer. He wrote occasional pieces for the Santa Fe New Mexican about regional history and contributed to a small literary magazine published out of Taos. He was known in the area as someone with opinions about land, water rights, and the proper stewardship of the northern New Mexico landscape. Opinions he expressed at public meetings with a fluency that some people found impressive and others found exhausting. He had attended 3 of the same community meetings as Teresa Sandoval in the months before her death. He had disagreed with her position at 2 of them. Publicly, with the kind of pointed thoroughness that people remembered afterward. On the morning of Saturday, April 17, 1993, Teresa Sandoval went for her regular road run along the river route north of town. She left her house at 6:15 a.m. She told David Archuleta, who was at her house that morning, that she would be back by 8. He made coffee and waited. At 8:30 a.m., she had not returned. He drove the route. At 9:12 a.m., David Archuleta found Teresa Sandoval's body on the shoulder of County Road 119, approximately 2.5 miles from her house. She was still in her running clothes. She had been struck from behind and had not, the medical examiner would later determine, survived long enough to have been aware of what happened. She was 29 years old. The turquoise bracelet was on the ground beside her left hand. It had come off in the fall. The Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office and the Espaola Police responded jointly. Lead investigator was Detective Ruben Montoya of the Sheriff's Office, who would work the case for the next 14 years before his retirement. He processed the scene with care. He noted the tire impressions on the soft shoulder. A vehicle had pulled off the road and then pulled back on, the tread pattern suggesting a truck or large SUV. He noted the bracelet's position, 3 inches from Teresa's left hand, face up, the silver setting catching the morning light. He photographed it without moving it, then logged it into evidence. He did not mention the bracelet's exact position in any public communication about the case. He noted it in his scene report. He considered it one of several details that investigators sometimes hold back, not because they are crucial to the investigation specifically, but because they belong to the victim and to the case and to no one else. The detail of the bracelet's position, face up, 3 inches from the left hand, appeared in no newspaper article. It appeared in no public records release. It was in Ruben Montoya's scene report, which was a law enforcement document, not a public one. Garrett Finch was identified as a person of interest within the first week. 2 witnesses remembered the public meetings and the pointed disagreements. A neighbor reported seeing what might have been Finch's Land Cruiser on the road near the river route on Saturday morning. Finch was interviewed on April 23, 1993. He was cooperative, articulate, and precise in a way that Montoya noted in his interview summary. Subject speaks with care, does not waste words, does not offer adjacents. Consistent, he had no alibi he could verify independently. He said he had been home, writing. He said he hadn't been near the river route. He said Teresa's death was a tragedy for the whole community. He said he had been at the same community meetings as her. Yes, he said they had disagreed. Yes, he said that was what public meetings were for. He was not arrested. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the scene. He attended Teresa Sandoval's funeral 12 days later. Ruben Montoya had been with the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office for 9 years when Teresa was killed. He was methodical and, by the accounts of colleagues who worked with him over the following decade, entirely unable to let this case settle into the background of a full caseload. It followed him in the way that a small number of cases follow investigators, not because it was unsolvable in theory, but because every practical avenue kept terminating before it produced what was needed. His attention kept returning to Garrett Finch. The neighbor's sighting of the Land Cruiser was not confirmable. The neighbor had seen a vehicle that might have been Finch's at a time that was consistent with the medical examiner's window on a road that Finch had reason to use. It was not enough. The public meeting disagreements established motive in the loosest possible sense, but disputes at public meetings were not unusual in a community as engaged as Espaola's, and in the absence of physical evidence connecting Finch to the scene, a theory of motive was not a case. Finch agreed to provide a DNA sample voluntarily in May 1993. The sample was submitted to the state lab in Santa Fe. It was not a match to the partial biological profile developed from the scene, a profile that was incomplete, developed from degraded material in an outdoor environment, and which the lab determined could not support a full identification. Montoya interviewed Finch a second time in September 1993. Finch was, again, consistent, cooperative, and precise. He mentioned in passing that he had been thinking about writing something about the case, a piece about how rural communities respond to violent crime, how they process grief, the dynamics of small-place tragedy. He said it in a tone that invited no particular response and received none from Montoya. It was noted in the interview summary. It was not followed up on. There was no reason, in September 1993, to follow up on a writer saying he was thinking about writing something. By 1995, 2 additional persons of interest had been identified and cleared. A man who had been seen on the River Road on multiple previous Saturday mornings turned out to have a medical appointment documented for April 17th. A former boyfriend of Teresa's from her Albuquerque years was interviewed and cleared by 2 independent witnesses. Garrett Finch remained the person Montoya believed was responsible. He had no evidence sufficient to charge him. In 1998, Finch self-published a book. It was titled Red Earth Memory, a true crime narrative of the Espaola Valley. It was about the murder of Teresa Sandoval. Montoya obtained a copy. He read it. The book was written in a first-person investigative voice, Finch as the narrator, conducting his own inquiry into a case he framed as mishandled by local law enforcement. It contained details that were largely consistent with public record. It contained one detail that Montoya read and then read again, and then set the book down and picked up his phone and called the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office told him that without knowing how Finch had obtained the detail, the book's contents were not, on their own, sufficient for a warrant or a charge. Finch could claim a source. He could claim speculation. He could claim coincidence. Montoya wrote in his case notes, book in evidence. Detail on P112 not publicly known. Source of detail unknown. Insufficient for charge without corroborating evidence. Case continues. He retired in 2007. He left a copy of the book in the case file. By 2000, 7 years had passed. Teresa's parents, Ernesto and Concepcion, had closed the hardware store in 1997. Ernesto's health had made the work unsustainable, and the weight of the years since 1993 had made everything else unsustainable in a quieter way. Concepcion kept Teresa's room the way it had been, which her younger daughter understood and did not comment on. Garrett Finch had moved from Espaola to Santa Fe in 1999. He continued to write local history pieces, occasional essays, a second self-published book in 2004 about water rights in the Rio Grande Basin that received modest regional attention. He gave talks at libraries. He was, in the Santa Fe literary community of the early 2000s, a minor figure of the kind that small cities cultivate and sustain, knowledgeable, prolific, somewhat difficult, reliable for a quote about regional history. Red Earth Memory had gone through 2 small print runs. It was available at independent bookstores in Santa Fe and Taos, and at the occasional library sale. The local true crime community had not discovered it, which meant it had never circulated widely enough to reach anyone with the specific knowledge needed to recognize what was on page 112. David Archuleta, who had found Teresa on County Road 119 on a Saturday morning, and who had not slept well since, had not read the book. He had been told it existed by a mutual friend in 1999, and had decided, carefully and deliberately, that reading it was something he was not able to do. He moved to Albuquerque in 2003. He kept a photograph of Teresa on his desk. Ruben Montoya, retired in Espaola, kept his copy of Red Earth Memory on the shelf in his home office. He had read page 112 enough times to have the sentence memorized. He had a standing agreement with himself that if he ever identified a path to using it, he would pursue it immediately. Teresa's college roommate, a woman named Linda Griego, had moved to Denver after graduation and built a career in social work. She and Teresa had stayed close through letters and occasional visits, and the phone calls that sustained long-distance friendships in the pre-internet era. After Teresa's death, Linda had followed the case from a distance, checking in with Concepcion once or twice a year, reading the occasional news item when the case was mentioned. She had never encountered Red Earth Memory. She did not know it existed. Until a Saturday morning in October 2023, when she found it in a box at a library sale in Denver for $2. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of careful research into lives that deserved more than they got. If you want us to keep telling these stories, take a second to like and subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to Teresa. She almost put it down after the first chapter. Linda Griego had been Teresa Sandoval's roommate for 2 years at the University of New Mexico. She had been at the funeral in Espaola in April 1993. She had sat with Concepcion in the kitchen of the Sandoval house the afternoon after the burial and listened to her talk about the turquoise bracelet, how it had been her mother's, how Teresa had put it on at 18 and never taken it off, how it had been found on the ground beside her hand, face up, the silver setting in the morning light. Concepcion had described it that way. Face up, 3 inches from the left hand, the silver setting catching the light. Linda had carried that image for 30 years. On page 47 of Red Earth Memory, Garrett Finch described the bracelet's position in a passage that used almost exactly those words. Face up, near the left hand, the silver glinting. Linda read it once. Then she sat very still for a long moment. Then she read it again. She thought about the ways it could be innocent. She made the list carefully. The way a person makes a list when they are hoping the list will be long enough to explain something away. A leak from a law enforcement source. A detail reconstructed from the medical examiner's report, somehow obtained. A coincidence of description. An educated guess about how a bracelet would fall. The list was not long enough. She called Concepcion Sandoval. Concepcion was 71 years old, and in her kitchen in Espaola, and she listened to what Linda described, and she said only, he was there. Linda called the Rio Arriba County Sheriff's Office the following morning. She asked to speak to whoever handled cold cases. She was connected to a detective named Priya Nair, 36 years old, 3 years in the department's cold case unit, who had inherited the Sandoval file from Montoya's successor, and who had read Montoya's note about page 112 enough times to recognize immediately what Linda Griego was describing. Nair called Ruben Montoya the same day. He was 72 years old and living in Espaola. He came in the next morning. He brought his personal copy of the book. The case now had what it had never had in 1993, a witness who could testify that the detail on page 112 had been communicated to her privately by the victim's mother and had never appeared in any public record, and a retired detective who could testify that the same detail was in his sealed scene report, and nowhere else. Together, those two testimonies established something no one had been able to establish in 30 years. That Garrett Finch had written down something he could only have known if he had been on County Road 119 on the morning of April 17, 1993. Nair obtained a new DNA sample from Finch through court order in January 2024. The partial profile from the 1993 scene had been reanalyzed using updated technology by the state lab in 2019 as part of a cold case review, and a more complete profile had been developed. The new sample from Finch was compared against it. The comparison returned a match. Garrett Finch was 72 years old in the winter of 2024. He had been living in Santa Fe for 25 years, in a house near the rail trail with a well-organized home office and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the specific self-presentation of a man who had spent decades constructing an identity around his own intellect. His neighbors described him as private and somewhat formal. His literary acquaintances described him as a difficult conversationalist who redirected every topic back to his own work. He had never married. He had no children. He had given a reading from Red Earth Memory at a Santa Fe bookstore in 1999 that 11 people had attended. He was arrested on February 8, 2024, at his home near the rail trail. Detective Nair and 2 Arriba County deputies came to the door at 8 in the morning. Finch answered in a bathrobe. He looked at Nair. He looked at the deputies. He looked at the copy of Red Earth Memory that Nair was holding. He said nothing. He was placed under arrest for the first-degree murder of Teresa Sandoval. The case against him was built on 3 converging elements: the DNA match to the updated profile from the 1993 scene, Linda Griego's testimony establishing that the page 112 detail had been communicated to her privately and was not in the public record, and Ruben Montoya's sealed scene report, which had documented the same detail in April 1993 and which had never been released. A forensic linguist also analyzed the book's prose for elements consistent with eyewitness knowledge rather than reconstructed reporting. A secondary analysis that the prosecution used to reinforce the DNA and testimonial evidence rather than as a standalone argument. What the investigation also established was the fuller picture of how the book had come to exist. Finch had begun writing it within months of Teresa's death. His notes, recovered from his home office during the search following his arrest, showed a manuscript in progress as early as the fall of 1993, contemporary with Montoya's second interview, in which Finch had mentioned, in passing, that he was thinking about writing something. He had been writing it while being interviewed about the crime he was writing about. He had, apparently, believed the act of writing constituted a kind of mastery over the situation. He had, apparently, believed that putting the truth on paper in the guise of investigation was a form of control. He had been wrong about that for 30 years. The Espala community's response to the arrest was a specific kind of quiet fury, the feeling of a thing that had been suspected, in some quarters, for decades, finally confirmed. People who had attended the same community meetings as Teresa and Finch in 1993 came forward to recount the tone of his disagreements with her. 2 additional witnesses who had seen the Land Cruiser on the River Road on the morning of April 17, 1993. Witnesses who had not come forward at the time because Finch had already been interviewed and cleared in their understanding, came forward now. Finch was tried in September 2024. He declined to testify. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Guilty, he was sentenced to life in prison. He was led from the courtroom without expression, the same practiced composure he had maintained across 3 decades of interviews, book readings, and public appearances. The composure of a man who had spent 30 years performing the role of someone who had nothing to hide and who had finally run out of audience to perform it for. Concepcion Sandoval, 72 years old, was in the front row. David Archuleta had driven down from Albuquerque. Linda Griego had flown in from Denver. Ruben Montoya sat in the gallery 3 rows back, and when the verdict was read, he put his face in his hands for a moment and then straightened up again. He had kept a copy of that book on his shelf for 26 years. There is a photograph of Teresa Sandoval taken by a student at Carlos Vigil Middle School in the spring of 1992, a year before she died. It was taken on a disposable camera at the end-of-year class celebration, and it shows her standing in the middle of her classroom, surrounded by 7th graders, who are all trying to crowd into the frame, several of them taller than she is, everyone laughing. She is in the center of it, arms open, completely undignified and completely happy. She is 28 years old, and she has a classroom full of books and 31 years of teaching ahead of her that she will never get to do. The turquoise bracelet is on her left wrist. Concepcion Sandoval stood outside the courthouse in September 2024 and said that the bracelet was still in the family, that it had been in the evidence locker for 30 years, and that after the trial she would ask for it back, and when she got it, she was going to give it to Teresa's youngest niece, who had never met her aunt, but who had grown up hearing her name spoken with the specific reverence that families reserve for people they grieve and celebrate in the same breath. Teresa Sandoval ran on the road along the river. She let her students choose their own books. She wore her grandmother's bracelet every day of her adult life. She called her parents on Sundays. She was 29 years old, and she was in her 5th year of building something in a classroom that her students were going to carry forward for the rest of their lives. Because that is what the best teachers do. They make something that keeps going without them. Garrett Finch spent 30 years believing that he had gotten away with it, and then spent those same 30 years writing about it. That contradiction, the impulse to confess dressed up as the impulse to investigate, is one that criminal psychologists have a language for, and that the rest of us understand in a simpler way. Some part of him knew what he had done, and could not be entirely quiet about it. The book was not cleverness. It was the opposite of cleverness. It was 30 years of the truth trying to get out through the only opening he left it. What do you do with the knowledge that the evidence against a killer was sitting in a library sale box for $2? That it had been available, readable, purchasable for 25 years by anyone who happened to pick it up? What does it mean that the one person with the specific knowledge to recognize what was on page 47 found the book by accident at a library sale in Denver on an autumn Saturday in 2023? And what do you think compelled Garrett Finch to write it at all? Justice came for Teresa Sandoval in her mother's 72nd year. Linda Griego recognized a detail she had carried for 30 years. Ruben Montoya kept the book on his shelf. If you believe that kind of faithful attention deserves to be witnessed, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.